If you're in the back, you should feel free to filter down. Doesn't matter to interrupt me while I'm talking. So welcome, Hampshire students, staff, faculty, and our 5 college colleagues, alums, and community. Thank you for participating in the 24th annual Eqbal Ahmad Lecture, Transgender Politics in the U.S. Streets and the State Houses. I offer a special welcome to Julie Diamond, Eqbal's wife, and Dora Ahmad, his daughter, joining us via Zoom along with other attendees from around the world. And I eagerly welcome all of the members of our campus community and those from the 5 colleges in the Valley who have come to participate. I am grateful to the Eqbal Ahmad Committee, including Margaret Cerullo and Amy Jordan, for their creativity in envisioning the topic for the lecture and their leadership in planning. Thank you to Sheila Lloyd, Beth Madison, and Doug Koziel from the Division of Justice, Equity, and Anti-Racism for creating an inspiring and timely program for the Community Day of Learning today, along with organizational support for this event. Kathy Hughes devoted a substantial time to logistics and contracts for this event. I'm grateful. And finally, thanks to John Bruner and Tyler Ortiz for their extensive and generous technical assistance setting up for the filming of this lecture. This endowed lectureship honors the teaching, scholarship, and activism of the late Eqbal Ahmad, a longtime Hampshire College professor. Professor Ahmad's faculty colleagues, former students, family, and friends from around the globe joined together to make this lecture series a continuing celebration of his life and work. It's an enduring legacy that honors the principles of the man for whom it is named, inspires us to reflect on the teacher's impact, and underscores the opportunity and obligation every educator has to make a difference for students, to infuse scholarship with activism, and to pursue justice. This lectureship brings to Hampshire College and our community distinguished scholars, political figures, activists, and artists engaged with questions of social justice and social movements in both the United States and the post-colonial worlds in which Eqbal was engaged. Today's program exemplifies that mission. As a witness to global conflict, Eqbal devoted his life's work to writing, teaching, and above all else, working for change. Eqbal was a participant in and witness to some of the most harrowing times and political struggles of the 20th century. The partition of India and Pakistan and its legacies, the Algerian Revolution, the Vietnam War, Middle East conflict, and the First Gulf War. His experience, his commitment to activism, his scholarship, all represent Hampshire College at its best. Part of this legacy is the astounding list of speakers that have visited Hampshire College to lead this lecture series, like Arundhati Roy, Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, Howard Zinn, Edward Said, Kimberly Crenshaw, Rashid Khalidi, Michelle Goodwin, Dorothy Roberts, and 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. Today, Zooey Zephyr joins this lineage. No pressure at all. Finally, I ask everyone to join us to take a moment to recognize Professor Margaret Cerullo, who is retiring this year. She has been the driving force behind this amazing speaker series, which is but a small aspect of her extraordinary contributions to Hampshire College. So thank you, Margaret. And that's your cue.
Thank you. That was very moving. Well, for a new generation of students and for others who have perhaps not attended prior Eqbal lectures, I thought it would be important to explain why, almost 25 years after his death, his friends and former colleagues continue to celebrate and commemorate Eqbal with this lecture. And why, especially since October 7th, not a few of us have joined the refrain, "If only Eqbal were here." Why? Along with his friend Edward Said in the 1980s, Eqbal met off the record with Israeli and American Jewish leaders who were puzzled about Palestinian intentions and the persistence of Palestinian resistance to Israeli practices. According to Said, Eqbal was the one person who consistently was able to communicate honestly with them, and while they disagreed, emerge with mutual respect. Why? Because Eqbal, I believe, saw the clash between Israelis and Palestinians as a tragic clash. In his memorable phrase, "between two communities of suffering." Also, Edward Said, upon Eqbal's retirement, pointed out that all of his writing was scattered to the four winds, and he urged him to gather it so that future generations would know of his brilliance, of his preternaturally, if that's a word, incisive analyses of global politics. And I would add his preternaturally prescient analyses of global politics. So one of my purposes today is to encourage you all to read the collective works of Eqbal Ahmad, which one copy I believe is available here, but I checked and it is in all of the 5 college libraries. And I am willing to send anyone PDFs of the distinct sections of the book or the entire book. And very briefly, I will tell you what the book is about, and I think you'll have some idea of why it's still relevant. But first, I want to tell you, as Ed indicated, Eqbal was present for some of the most important events of the 20th century. And I want to alert you to the story of his experience in the partition is captured in a BBC documentary called "Stories My Country Told Me." So you can access that online, and Eqbal Ahmad on the Old Trunk Road. But the 2 new things I learned this year about Eqbal, aside from the fact that he knew Gandhi as a 12-year-old, he was Gandhi's assistant and traveled throughout the Indian subcontinent with him. He also knew and collaborated, worked closely with Frantz Fanon during the Algerian Revolution. He also collaborated on the great film, the great revolutionary film of the 20th century, The Battle of Algiers. But these, so that he was part of the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Black Civil Rights movement. Every now and again, you will read things like, in a small town in Tennessee or somewhere in the US South, today there were arrested 5 Black Americans and 1 Pakistani. Now you know who that 1 Pakistani was. Also, Eqbal in the 70s was accused by J. Edgar Hoover of a plot to kidnap Henry Kissinger and blow up the heating systems in federal buildings. That headline was 4 radical Catholics and 1 Pakistani. So, but this year I learned 2 new things about Eqbal. One was that he was friends with Malcolm X, and that when he was at Princeton studying for his PhD, he invited Malcolm to speak at the first non-African American institution in the US where Malcolm X spoke. And then he showed up in the 2000s as an influence, before there were influencers, in a feminist genderqueer arts journal, a little known story with which I will end my remarks. But now I'm going to tell you very, very briefly about the sections of the book so you can request them, and I hope you're motivated to see them. The first is Revolutionary Warfare and Counterinsurgency, about which he was the preeminent expert from a critical perspective. And that section of the book includes a very, very important piece, which I'll return to in a minute, how to tell when the rebels have won. Another piece in that section, radical but wrong, his critique of Che Guevara and Regis Debray's Foucault theory. Also, a piece called The Making of the Battle of Algiers, which he actually delivered as a lecture in a Hampshire class that he and Carol Bengelsdorf and I co-taught before he left Hampshire. The student evaluations for that course, favorite part of the course, Eqbal. Least favorite part of the course, when Eqbal left. That's only the first section. I promise I'll go more quickly. Section 2, Third World Politics, Pathologies of Power, Pathologies of Resistance, in which he examined post-colonial systems of power and the roots of the religious right in the post-colonial world. Section 3, On the Cusp of the Cold War, with his really important analysis of the Cold War from the standpoint of its victims. Section 4, the Palestine-Israeli conflict, which is unmatched, and I really commend it to you in these days. And finally, a section on South Asia, including his great piece on Afghanistan, Bloody Games, which really predicted the mess the US would get itself in if it intervened in Afghanistan. I want to tell you one more thing about Eqbal. In the spirit of our land acknowledgements, Eqbal came to the US for the first time in the 50s on a Rotary scholarship to Occidental College, where he wrote probably one of the first works by a non-Native scholar on Native American resistance to settler colonialism. Eqbal told me that when he first arrived to the US and saw cowboy and Indian movies, he always identified with the Indians. Why? They always were portrayed as an elemental enemy, arriving in screaming hordes with no history, no family ties, no hopes, fears, or grievances. And it was those histories, those hidden or disavowed histories of Native American life and resistance that Eqbal sought to capture in his undergraduate thesis. Later, he wrote a really important article called Political Culture and US Foreign Policy, in which he argued that Indian fighting was the template for US foreign policy. Smoke them out, wipe them out, mow the grass. I promise I'll compress. So now I'm going to tell you about where Eqbal appeared in the feminist genderqueer arts journal, which you can also look up online. It's called LTTR, like letter without the E's. Oh, you know it. Teal knows it. Good for you, Teal. I should have known that. Number 5 of LTTR is called Positively Nasty. And that's where Eqbal's How to Tell When the Rebels Have Won appears with a commentary by Emily Royston, his former student. This is how she introduces the piece. I am writing between great and radical influences, my one true hero, Eqbal Ahmad, and my experiences in contemporary feminist genderqueer life to declare the necessity of their coalition. I write to explicitly align this community of readers with the tumultuous potential of my mentor's 1965 treatise on revolutionary warfare. So I hope that's an enticement. It's very easy to find. I was able to find it, and I'm not good at these things. So finally, I'm going to speak to you as students as if Eqbal were here. The greatest rewards of teaching, he said, are all those students, present or former, who take risks in the pursuit of a just and moral order, crossing boundaries and breaking barriers of ideology and conformity. When asked in an interview what advice he would give to students, he responded, number 1, read. Number two, intervene. For God's sake, let us not be only consumers of information. Each person has some truth, some knowledge, some understanding of the world that is different from that of the dominant media institutions. The moment that you find that your truth clashes with what is being peddled as their truth, intervene. And that seemed an excellent segue to today's speaker, Representative Zooey Zephyr from Montana, who will now be further introduced by Dana Ahern. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to you all today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dana Ahern. I'm a visiting assistant professor of queer. Oh, is it not? Is this? There you go. Thank you. I'm visiting assistant professor of queer studies here at Hampshire. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed guest here today, Representative Zooey Zephyr. The United States, and indeed the world, has entered what can only be called an interesting moment in time. An influx of increasingly violent legislation, like anti-trans bathroom bills, began in the early 2010s, foreshadowed something darker to come, with the election and subsequent politics of the 45th president. Since that time, we've seen legislative attacks on queer and trans people reach an all-time high. Gun violence, which had been on the decline, reached a steady increase since 2014, and attacks on education that try to prevent students from learning about racism, colonialism, sexuality, and gender have reached new heights. However, with these attacks too come opportunities for resistance, for refusals, and for courage. We're not unfamiliar with that resistance here at Hampshire, as we welcome a cohort of students from New College of Florida who so intimately understand these students so intimately understand what is at stake during this political moment. And neither too does our guest today, Representative Zephyr. Representative Zephyr is the first trans woman to be elected to the Montana legislature in 2023, representing Missoula in an otherwise strongly Republican-held state. She was banned from the House floor following debates around Senate Bill 99, insidiously titled the Youth Health Protection Act, meant to prohibit transgender children from accessing gender-affirming care. Representative Zephyr, alongside other recent examples like Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson of Tennessee, were expelled from the Tennessee House of Representatives for protesting gun violence, follow a legacy of radical legislators who speak back to these attempts at legislative and imperial violence. We're reminded too of Representative Julian Bond, who was unconstitutionally banned from his seat of the Georgia legislature because of his vocal anti-imperialist stance, speaking back against the US war in Vietnam in 1965. As Representative Zephyr stated in her opposing remarks on the bill, if you vote yes on this bill and yes on these amendments, I hope the next time there's an invocation, when you bow your heads in prayer, you see blood on your hands. Representative Zephyr bravely points us to the significance of these attacks on all of our lives, the importance of understanding that these issues are not in isolation from one another, and we must fight back and refuse to be curtailed by these acts of violence. Please join me in welcoming today Representative Zooey Zephyr as she presents her lecture. They say get back, we say fight back, transgender politics in the US streets and state houses.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that introduction and the slew of introductions and the mini lecture on Eqbal Ahmad. I feel just so honored to be here with all of you today. I want to start this conversation with what has been the most common question I have gotten since the Montana legislature adjourned in May, which is, are you okay? How you holding up? And every time I wrote a public statement in the legislature, I signed it with pride and determination. And I stand before you today feeling both of those things, my heart swelling with both of those things. And I feel, quite frankly, more hope than I had felt in a long time following the legislature. And that can be a weird thing to say in a moment where I was booted out of the legislature, in a year where over 500 bills targeting our community have come before the state houses across the country. And so I want to talk sort of in long, how do you get there? What was the path that led me to politics? What was I seeing in the legislature? And how can you come out of an experience like that sort of on fire with hope? And for me, I want to talk about initially, how did I get into the legislature? And how that began is, like a lot of people, I saw community suffering. I came out, and like many people in the trans community, I was not accepted by my family. And my city of Missoula took care of me deeply and fully. I had faculty, I worked at the university, and my boss changed our bathroom to a gender neutral bathroom within 2 weeks of me coming out. I taught dance, I taught Lindy Hop in town, and I had, farm hands coming in with their partners teaching dance, being like, if anyone gives you trouble, like, you let them know that we've got your back. And so my community supported me. And that, after a while, that leads you in your heart for saying, how do you help? What does that look like? And I remember meeting with a dear friend of mine, Zuri Moreno, who worked intermittently with the ACLU of Montana and was an activist, radical activist in their own right. And I sat down with them and I said, how do you get involved? Like, I've got this skill set. I want to do something. How do you get from this place of experience and desire to help into helping? And they, much wiser than I felt at the time, just said, moment will show up. You'll know, just be ready to do something, step in when the time is there. And I sort of wound up doing community activism, helping people. There was a trans teen who was a 14-year-old trans boy in a choir class in rural Montana at a school that, when the school tried to start a GSA, parents showed up with AR-15s and prayed outside of the halls of the school. Yeah. This student came out, a young trans boy at 14, and the response was half of his choir class dropped the class because they did not want to sing with a trans student. The other half took care of him. And we got a call from his mother, and they said, hey, can you show some sign of support? And we rolled up with about 15 trans adults to say, hey, I know it's hard in high school for a lot of reasons, it's especially hard for you, but look, we make it. We're out on the other side, not just having survived, but being pillars of our community and loved by our communities. And if you can make it, you'll be there too. Did a lot of different work, helping file discrimination claims. I briefly worked tracking the movements of armed neo-Nazis during George Floyd protests, and felt a lot of sort of the necessity of intersectionality in those moments. When you look at the way that, when it came to the George Floyd protests, all of the security in Montana were like, the community security was the queer community. And then when protests were being organized by the queer organizers, our security was the BIPOC community. And so seeing the way that we were lifting each other up gave me hope. And that led quickly to working on policy for the city of Missoula, which is my home. And the interesting thing about activism is you are sort of patching the wounds that are left by government. Some of those wounds are intentional. There are people in positions of power who want to hurt communities. Whether they realize it or not, they are crafting policies that directly hurt communities. And sometimes you are patching the unintentional wounds of government. Government is an imperfect entity, and every policy will leave some potential harm for folks. And the issue we found in 2020, or that I found in my heart, was the wounds were coming too fast. We had COVID, We had the George Floyd protests. We had the rise of anti-abortion policy. We had the rise of anti-LGBTQ policy. And suddenly it felt too much. And when it was too much, I said, what the hell is my government doing? I'm going to go bang on the door a little bit, and testified before the legislature, testified before the governor's office, and was met with a room of people who, when community showed up and said, we are suffering from the laws you design, they plugged their ears and said, we don't want to hear it. And I did what any reasonable human being would do and said, well, if you're not going to listen to me from the outside, I'm going to bang the door and I'm going to get on the inside. And I sat down with my senator at the time, Senator Bryce Bennett, and I said, hey, I asked an important question. I said, I've got this list of skills, you know, working at the university, being connected to the community in all these different ways. Is this a room that my voice can do good in? And what Senator Bennett said to me was, not only is it a voice your room can do good in, it's the room you need to be in right now. It's the room your voice can do the most good in. And so I ran and knocked just an obscene amount of doors, and was blessed to be elected to represent the 100th district in Montana. Now, one of the questions I often get is, did you realize that things were going to get as bad as they were going to get this quickly? And campaigning in Missoula, no. I was having one-on-one conversations with folks, Republicans and Democrats, who by and large had 1,000 different things that they cared about. Very low on the totem pole was hurting LGBTQ people. And then I got to the legislature, and I decided that I was going to try to do a diary on TikTok of sort of my experience. And the first video on my TikTok way back at the beginning is an hour before orientation for all the legislators. And I said, we'll find out. You know, I'm scared, I'm excited. We'll find out what it's like. And we showed up and we elected our leadership for the minority party, the Democrats. And the Republicans were electing the Speaker of the House. And I heard that it was a race between a far-right candidate and a more moderate Republican. I say moderate Republican. He had every day he wore his "Don't Tread on Me" pin, so slightly more moderate Republican. But the far right candidate from the back channels that we heard was running on a campaign of he would lock me out of the restrooms in the Capitol. He was elected by 2 votes. Later that day, there was a closed door meeting with him and all of the Republican women about what to do about the trans person in office. So I knew very quickly what the stakes were. Now, I also knew that not everyone was like that. There was a 21-year-old Republican woman who was telling me, hey, here's the conversations happening about you. Here's what they're trying to do. It's very scary. Like, if you need support, let us know. But I knew very quickly what the stakes were and what they were trying to do. I also learned very quickly that you have to stand up to that right away. And the second day of orientation, I walked up to the speaker and I said, hey, I'm hearing this stuff. We're not going to have a problem, are we? Because it's going to get real bad real fast if you're going to lock a legislator out of a bathroom. And I said, you know, that doesn't play well. You know, it's going to look stupid. You know, that's not why we were sent here. And he said, yep, I agree. We're not going to do anything. Don't worry about it. And by and large, they didn't. They put a lock on the entire bathroom so that if someone were scared of me, boo, by the way, they could lock all like 30 stalls and stay by themselves in the bathroom. And I think the social pressure of how stupid that looks wound up working. And and this is sort of the dichotomy of what you see on the front and what happens in the back, because on the back end, you know, you have long sessions where you're spending hours and hours on the floor. You get up and you go use the restroom. And of course, I'm in there with a dozen different Republican women and we're just talking, having a great time. How's your weekend? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And then you go back out and they're like, anyways, these LGBTQs, super dange. So you see that as like the entry point. And then you watch bill after bill after bill show up in Montana and show up on legislatures across the country, carbon copies of legislation brought by national organizations that are trying to harm us. And I think when it comes to like hoping and feeling that hope, one of the things I often say is the first step of that is not averting your eyes from the reality of what we are facing. The LGBTQ community right now, and trans people in particular, are facing efforts of eradication. You know, Michael Knowles said it at CPAC. The goal was eradication of trans people from public life entirely. That is the aim. Speaking more broadly or more specifically about that, we saw policies designed to erase trans people's pasts, their presents, and their futures. When you craft a policy that says, hey, your memoirs are not allowed, they're licentious and practically porn, there are no LGBTQ memoirs allowed, that is erasing an individual's history. It is erasing the kinds of stories I wish, going to that 14-year-old and saying, hey, we can make it to the other side. That's what memoirs allow people. It allows them to see themselves. When you erase an LGBTQ person's history, you're robbing them and you're robbing the youth's future. Collectively, when you ban drag, you are banning an art form that is deeply connected to what it means to be queer in this country. When you look at Stonewall and that, you go back to 3 articles of clothing laws and strict, rigid policing of gender expression through clothing. That art form is tied to our history. And when the representative who brought that ban on drag stood up, and one of the questions he asked is, he said, no one can give me a good answer why kids are going to drag shows. And I stood up on the floor and I said, your answer is because we lived. We lived through efforts to eradicate us. We lived to the point where we were allowed to get married and have families. And now we have children of our own. We are accepted by our communities and they have children, and they are sharing in an art form that helps explain our past and our community to them. That is why, because we lived. We also have seen bills targeting our present. Obviously, things like bathroom bans, bills that ban government documents, make it hard to exist in public life, to access jobs, to just feel comfortable out in the world. We also see attempts banning our futures. And one that's near and dear to my heart is Senate Bill 458 in Montana, was a bill that tried to misdefine sex. They tried to define sex as binary in a way that wound up excluding trans, intersex, two-spirit, non-binary people again and again. And there was a section in that, they updated 40 different sections of code. And one of the sections was on interment after death. And the way the policy was written, I'm thinking about my life. I'm married, not quite yet. I'm engaged to a wonderful woman, Erin, and she has a son, and I have a stepson now. And I hope, after a long life, my tombstone reads something along the lines of, "Here lies Zooey Zephyr, beloved wife, beloved mother, etc., etc." The state of Montana says that's fine and dandy, but in the back of this, we're going to erase all of that and say M, male. That is the erasure of a future. And then there's no more clearer example of erasing a future of banning the healthcare trans people need. I spoke out on Senate Bill 99 multiple times in committee. I spoke out against it on the House floor when it came through the first time. I spoke out, and that time I gave a speech not to the other legislators, but to the camera. And what I said was, please stay alive. I said, we are going to make it through this. We are going to beat these in the court. We are winning in the court of public opinion. And eventually, someday, after we drag this old institution called our legislature, kicking and screaming, we will win in these halls as well. And then the bill went to the Senate and passed. And then it was amended by the governor. And the governor of Montana does line item amendments and changes some definitions and things that he wanted, let's get some more specificity to the cruelty. But governor's amendments also come with letters, the sort of cover letter explaining the changes. And the governor's amendment said 2 things in particular. First, it said, trans people deserve our compassion and respect. And the second thing it said is gender-affirming care is, quote, Orwellian newspeak. And I got up on the House floor and I said, trans people do not need your compassion and respect. We need the health care that allows us to live our lives. I then told a story and said, listen, if you are forcing a trans teen to go through puberty that they were assigned at birth, and they know they are trans, if you're forcing them to go through their birth puberty, that is tantamount to torture, and the body should be ashamed. At which point the speaker said, this body will not be made to feel shame. And I responded saying, then I hope you see the blood on your hands. We saw that totality of the attacks. So in the face of that, and in the face of the cruelties that came in the expulsion, how do you feel hope? For me, that came from the response. It's easy to see cruelty and the things people are willing to do, and more importantly, as I'll talk about, what they are willing to throw away to accomplish that cruelty. But I also got to live the response from folks. And one of my favorite things to talk about is the moment this happened, there were two groups who stood up in support. The first group was my union, the Public Employees Union of Montana, MFPE. My union said, we've got your back, and it's not an accident we've got your back, because unions recognize the way those in power will leverage every tool at their disposal to cause harm and be left unaccountable. The second group that stood up was the American Indian Caucus in Montana. In the first rules meeting, Representative Stuart Paraguay of Montana called it pretty plain, said, trans people may be the target of this legislature today, but we're not fooled. We've seen renditions of these attacks again and again and again, and I will tell you, my community sees them for what they are, the road to fascism. That is what she said. Indeed. That is a community response immediately in the moment. I also saw the way people rallied around in the building. Many people likely saw this, but I sat on a public bench outside of the room, and the first thing that happened is the speaker came and said, you can't sit on a public bench. And he had the great insight to do that while the Associated Press was filming me. And I was like, okay, before God and the camera, tell me again, the public bench? And his response to that was not to go oopsie doopsie. He said, I've got a more clever strategy. Tomorrow, instead of telling her she can't sit there, I'll send my mom an hour early. And the next day he sent his mother and several legislators' wives to sit on that bench. Now, when I talk about cruelty, I think you cannot control the cruelty. You can control your response, and you can control the way the cruelty is revealed. And throughout the legislature, what we were trying to say, and what happened with a lot of the protests, is people said, yes, she stood up on a bill about LGBTQ rights. Yes, that mattered. But when you actually are being silenced in the legislature, that's not about LGBTQ rights inherently at that point. It's actually about democracy. It's about if we send elected representatives to speak on our behalf, and they're not able to, do we have democracy? And folks recognize that very quickly. It's why often when I spoke with Representative Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, and Gloria Johnson in Tennessee, we were having the conversation of saying, I see the parallels here. What's happening is when people in power, it's no longer enough for people in power to say, oh, we can get the policies across. It's saying we need to silence the dissent entirely, and when people hold us accountable, we'll do everything in our power to get rid of them. That's often why I say, again, not what are the policy questions that we're debating, it's what are people willing to throw away to achieve those policy goals. That becomes a huge concern. The third thing that I find to be a sort of well of hope in terms of the response is larger community responses. And yes, that can mean my community of Missoula, places like this, overwhelmingly supportive. I won my district with 80% of the vote. I was going home to people who understood the urgency of the fight. But that is not the extent of the support. When you attack our fundamental democratic institutions, people across all walks of life recognize that. I was checking into a hotel about 3 weeks after everything went down, and it was midnight, and I was just sleepy as heck. And all of a sudden, the security guard looks over and just starts sidling. And I'm looking over, and he gets real close to me, and he just leans over and whispers, "The National Guard has your back." And I was like, oh, yeah. It's like, it's a strange thing to hear at 12:10 in the morning, but thank you so much. Like, yes. And then one of my favorite stories to tell about this is in June, I went to Glacier National Park in Montana with my fiance. Glacier National Park, sorry, it's very beautiful out here. I'll be biased. Glacier's the prettiest place in the whole damn country. Incomprehensible verticality. And what happens in a place like Glacier, it was my fiance's first time. And what happens when it's someone's first time at Glacier is you pull off on the side of the road, because every 500 feet, it's the prettiest thing you've ever seen. And we pulled off on this one stop, and we look at this beautiful waterfall, and up comes behind us an F-250. And out of it hops this larger mid-50s dude. He's got the boots, the Wranglers, the plaid. If the NRA magazine had stickers on the inside, he'd have been, complimentary. And he walks up and he goes, "Zooey Zephyr," and just what's first words out of his mouth, pointing at me. I was like, okay, 200 miles from any civilization, like, ready, let's go. This is politics. Let's do the conversation. Let's have it. And he goes, "Before we get into anything, I want you to know I'm a Republican." And I was like, context clues, like I get it, like I followed the, and he goes, "But I'm not like them." And I went, "Say more." He goes, "I'm more of a, John McCain." And he listed some moderates in the Republican Party in Montana. Again, moderates in the Republican Party in Montana. And he said, "That's kind of my speed." And he goes, "But I want you to know, you're my hero. I'd have sat on that bench for you." And so we sat on the side of this road for 15 minutes, and we talked policy. And we talked the things, I asked the same question that I had asked on the thousands of doors I knocked during my campaign. What is it Montana could do better at? What's in your heart on there? If you had a magic wand, what would you fix? And we sat and we talked. And we obviously talked shop about, property taxes and the impacts of that, ag land, etc. But by and large, what we talked about was bullies, cruelness, and the frustration with that. When you send people to govern, what do you do when the people you sent there bully communities and coalesce power? How do you respond to that? That's something that gives me hope, seeing the breadth of that response where I go. And it's probably an important moment to stop in this and talk about hope. I know we're in Dickinson land, hope is a thing with feathers, et cetera, et cetera. I think John Green made a beautiful TikTok about it at some point. We got the Green fans, yeah, love it. I'm proud to report Hank Green is my constituent, so yeah, love it. But for me, when I think about hope, I gave a speech in San Francisco talking about hope, and someone stood up in the Q&A section and said, "Hope is meaningless. Hope gets us in trouble. Hope placates us." To which my response was, "Oh, no. We're talking about two different things. Hope is a fuel you burn through. Like, hope is not a laurel you sit on or something you're just, oh, thank goodness I've got this hope. It's a resource, and you need it to keep going." When I ran for office and I asked that question about, is this a room I can be in? He said, "Yeah, it is." And what we talked about is sort of the two sides of this. What are the things on the outside that you want to do? What are your policy goals that you want to accomplish in the room? And what is the inextinguishable thing inside you that when it gets hard, you won't stop? And to me, that is the hope. That's something that I hold on to there. Now, it's all lovely and dandy to say, we've got this, hope is a fuel, hope is da-da-da. What do you do with that? How do you build that? And for me, one of the things that, I hear a lot from folks, especially young folks, is I want to do good, I want to do this, but I couldn't do politics. I couldn't do what you do in that room. And I always like to pause and say, I am in a room where laws get written. It is an important room to be in. And I am blessed in this moment to be invited into a lot of rooms like this one, interviews and stuff where I can have these conversations, but the reach that I have, whatever it was, would not be as much of an impact as every individual in every room that they are in standing up. So I often tell folks, it's not about finding the room that I'm in or how do you get there. It's where is your voice needed? Where can you get in? And when I started that activism work, I had a co-activist. And the co-activist often said, we often joked that our roles together was she would kick the door down and then I would convince you that you invited us in. Politics is a little bit like that by yourself. You have to kick the door in and be like, hey, thank you for the invite. It was so lovely. I'm glad we could sit down and have this conversation. But also to get there, you have to do a lot of other types of community work and care work. And so I often, when I talk about that work and that care, I frame it as what I would call concentric circles of care. Circles within circles within circles. The first circle is that inextinguishable fire. It's the part of you that has to go home at the end of the night and say, I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of what I stand for. I did damn good today, or I got it wrong, but you know what? We can do better. You got this. That has to exist, because no matter what you want to do in the world, if you can't stand tall at the end of your day, I'm not going to say don't have imposter syndrome. We've all got it. I've got it. But if you can stand tall at the end of the day, proud of who you are, that is needed. The second circle is not even activist community, but just who is going to uplift you? Who is going to hold you at the end of the day when you're not able to stand tall by yourself? After that, you start getting into the community work. Who are the organizations doing the work on the ground? Who do you want to be involved with? Where are the rooms that your voice is needed in? Once you find that and you've got those spaces, beyond, you start looking for the other circles surrounding you. It is not an accident that the fight for trans rights was integrally connected to the fight for abortion access in this country. And the people working on those issues recognized it. The people attacking those issues sure as hell recognized it. I know in the intro, we talked about the Tennessee Three, about my being silenced. It's also important to recognize Representative Maury Turner in Oklahoma, first non-binary legislator out in Oklahoma, great friend. First black representative representing a non-majority black district, and Muslim representative in Oklahoma, sort of triple intersections and just getting the, you know what, kicked out of them. President's right here, I'm not gonna swear. And then you also had people in Nebraska, like Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, Senator Megan Hunt, Senator John Frederickson, who filibustered the entirety of the session and said, hey, if you drop this anti-trans bill, we'll work on stuff. If you drop it, we'll work on stuff. And the right said, no, this is our #1 priority over anything else. And they couldn't get it across the line until they edited it. And the title of it was like Protecting Children. And they have a single subject bill. And they said, you know what? We're going to fold something else in here. And they said, protecting children means stopping trans people, but it also means stopping abortions. And that's how they got their bill across the line, by combining those attacks. We recognize, they recognize that, we recognize that defense. We also recognize in the fight for trans rights that there's another circle there, the disability community. if you are standing up and saying, hey, doctors need to believe us when we tell you what's going on, well, you find very quickly that there's a lot of people who said, God, yeah, I wish my doctor would believe me when I told them what was going wrong. So we find ourselves in resonance with disability rights activists. We find ourselves in resonance with women broadly, talking about their wishing their doctors would listen to them. We find ourselves in resonance with a large swath of Black Americans who have been historically discriminated by the healthcare industry. And so that is that next layer of circle. And you find yourself, who are you in connection with? Because like we know from the union fight, as I talked about earlier, it's a lot harder to take a community down if we are standing together with a lot of communities in need. So to me, that is that work there. All of it, though, stems from that place of going home at the end of the day and being proud of who you are. And then I do want to, in sort of a pseudo close, say that I talk about kicking a door in. One of the interesting things is that you will find, if you are connected to community in that way, sometimes you go to kick a door in and there's somebody already in there opening it up for you. And if you are rooted in all the different communities doing the work, you will find doors more often than not are opened to you. That to me is the important work. And then in terms of, actually, I'm going to extend my close into another direction. I talked briefly about like finding the room that your voice can do good in. To me, there's something, I remember when I was going to college, my parents both said, find your passion. Zooey, find your passion. That's your goal. We're sending you to college, find your passion. My dad, when he said it, meant capital P passion. What is the thing you were put on this earth to do? My mother meant it with passion, with like the S's were dollar signs. And that's not to disparage her, but it was like, find the thing that you like, that will make you money, that will allow you to live a happy life. That is your passion, because then you're not, working nonstop. You get to retire and you get to live happily. I spent my life chasing what I would call lowercase p passions, the smallest passions. And I was in a meeting in New York, and someone said, wow, you've got so much life experience. And I was like, no. I just chased a lot of little passions. I taught Lindy Hop. I taught vintage swing dancing. I spent 3 years as a competitive video game player. Let's go Super Smash Brothers. I did an undergrad in creative writing. I was in grad school for creative writing in literature. These are all disconnected. I was working at the university. I was going to farmers markets and park cleanups and little things like that. None of those were, let me build this beautiful portfolio. I was following the things that my heart felt called to. How do you listen to that and go towards it? And what I found was, obviously looking hindsight is 2020, but what a literary criticism master's allows you to do. I was studying technology in the Middle Ages, the integration of technology and humanity in the Middle Ages. And if you are reading, doing a lit crit master's, you are reading dozens and dozens and dozens of different essays and trying to find connections. And you're reading them often in Middle English. And there is no law that is too incomprehensible. If you can read Middle English, it all feels super easy. And then you also begin to recognize patterns. The way Lit Crit felt like that was an important step for me to say, okay, I see the way parental rights shows up on 9 different bills, all disconnected. I see the way parental rights suddenly vanishes when it's the parental rights of someone who affirms their trans child. We can talk about that connection and call it out. And importantly, when it comes to calling it out, I felt like my creative writing degree helped, because that was something that allowed me to talk about narratives. How do you take information and find the story behind that information? Because if you're trying to explain to a community, hey, there's a lack of action on property taxes in the state of Montana and the Democrats proposed a circuit breaker. I noticed everyone was very excited about the circuit breaker. Exactly. You have to find a way to narrativize it. You have to find a way to package it in somehow so people can understand it. Those allow you that. Something as silly as spending a couple years playing a professional video game shifts the way you think about intellectual property law and right to repair laws in our country. Bit by bit by bit, all those lowercase p passions become a life you are proud of and a litany of experience that you can take with you into whatever room you go into. So I hope you find your capital P passion. I hope you find the one with the dollar signs. Woohoo. I certainly did not find that. State legislators do not get paid. But more importantly, I hope you find the room that you feel like you need to get into. I hope you can kick the damn door down. And when you get in, I hope people understand that they should have been inviting you in all along. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I believe, I don't want to speak after a beautiful close, but I believe we're going to do a Q&A now, which is my favorite part, personally. So. Thank you.
Thank you
Right on
so
time.
much. Thank you, Representative Zephyr, for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm so moved and led by all you've shared with us today. My name is Teal Van Dyke. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and educator, local gender alchemist, and current director of accessibility here at Hampshire College, and I'm honored to moderate today's Q&A. Before we begin, I wish to extend my personal gratitude in memory of Eqbal Ahmad and his family and friends who have joined us today. As an alumni and staff member of the college, this is my 17th Eqbal Ahmad Lecture, and I've been moved and led deeply in my own political formation by this lecture series over the years, as well as by Ahmad's life and legacy. Now more than ever, I invite us to turn to Eqbal's writing and to his work, as we ask questions about how to move together into the future we are building out of the challenges that we face. And Representative Zephyr, I know that we've both worked as university administrators. Woo! Woo! Radical stuff, folks, yeah. But it can be. And I wanted to, this copy of Eqbal's writing has lived in my office as I've worked with students over the years, and I wanted to offer this to you as a souvenir of your time with us and as a chance to connect with his writing and his life more deeply as you go on.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So in the spirit of these questions, we reach our own time of questioning here in our Q&A. Here's how this is going to work. Today we are gathering your questions for Representative Zephyr using a digital tool Menti, and Taylor, thank you for your work to help set this up. We have questions that have already come in from folks in the room, from folks online, and I think we'll put that QR code back up if you are thinking of questions as those percolate. And then after I ask Zooey a few questions that I've come prepared with, I'll try to gracefully weave questions from folks in the room and on Zoom as we go through our Q&A. So, as you mentioned in your lecture, I was really moved in preparing to speak with you today by the thousands of doors you've knocked on in Montana. And by, I know that as you knocked on those doors, there must have been so many moments of taking a deep breath for the conversation in the doorway that was about to happen. These moments of connection with who knows who might be behind door number 1 or 2 or 6,000. And I also am thinking about a quote in an interview with LGBTQ Nation about the power of trans love, where you said, and I quote, "There's this inclination to see the bills that are coming, what they're trying to take away."
And it's important to say, hey, the thing you can't take away is that I love myself deeply and I love my partner. And that joy and that love, if we center that, that's the most important thing. Why would I want to back away from that in the slightest, end quote.
Good quote.
So, great quote, I thought. And it really resonated with me as somebody who has been deeply carried by the power of trans love into being and into living and into loving in the communities that I have the privilege to serve in my own life. I wondered if you'd tell us more about what you've noticed after all those doorway conversations. How does that spirit of trans love, that possibility of connection, propel you as you keep knocking on the doors of justice?
So, to speak very directly about the trans joy, one of the questions that I get very frequently is, how would you define queer joy? And my answer to that is, queer joy is the things they cannot take away. And that, for me, is a love of myself. That is a love of my partner. That is a love of my community in Missoula. That is the dancing that I get to do. That is that vast array of things. And so when you talk about carrying that joy with you, you know, I looked at, and my fiance and I have differing views on this, but I have said, you know, these bills can do a lot of things. They can separate families. They can remove healthcare. They can block us from jobs and opportunities, but they will not make me hate myself. And quite frankly, they will not make me afraid. Like, I will stand in those halls and say, you could try to do a lot of things, but I'm sure as hell not going to cower out of this room. That is not for everybody, but that has been my answer. And so it's also important that that's an answer I've come to in a long time, you know, being very vulnerable. When I was loved and supported by Missoula. When I first went to knock doors, I lived on a second-story apartment, and I left my house on December 26th to 27th, and I walked down the stairs, and I sat on the bottom stair, and I just started crying before I knocked a single door, because I was scared. I said, it only takes one person. It only takes one person to see me and have a conversation about trans rights, and suddenly the first trans candidate is gone. You don't know. I was scared. And it was I talked about those circles of care. It was through my community who came and said, like, we got your back if you need help, you know, speaking to representatives who'd been elected and talked about the experience, where you sort of take that inhalation and go. And what I found in the doors was what I had found broadly in the community: love and support. That the rhetoric that the right tried to push was not the reality of my community. It was not you know, when I say, what can Montana do better at? It didn't matter if it was a lifelong Republican or a leftist. They were saying, oh, here's the things that I care about. And, you know, remember some old guy up there being like, Zooey Zephyr, reading trans candidate, CZ top, CZ. And you're like, yes, that's perfect. Like, that's the weird little line you're going to go for. And he's like, where's your beard? And I was like, I got rid of it. And he's like, ha. And off we go. That's the conversation. He's not looking to hurt a queer person. And so finding like that community was part of that. And then the second part is you quickly find that your community is actually full of experts. You know, there are people there who, you knock a door and someone's like, oh, hey, I install solar panels. And I'm like, oh yeah, energy, solar, let's talk about clean energy. And he's like, yes, but actually, let's talk about how solar installation forces local union jobs to exist, because they have to be repaired and installed and all of that work. And suddenly you're going to a next door and you're talking to someone who does work on housing policy and how they can try to shift policy to get solar installed. And you start to build policy understanding, not through your own brilliance, but through listening to community. And the more you do that, the easier it is to knock a door and be like, oh, what expert am I going to meet today? Let's roll the dice.
Thank you. You have spoken about your journey through policymaking. And I know that in your platform, I really see the way you've taken that experience of talking to your constituents, of talking to so many people, asking them these questions, what can we do better? And translated that into a platform really focused on the practical needs of the people, healthcare, housing, human rights, and beyond. And isn't it exciting in these moments of escalating political, environmental, economic crisis manufactured for profit? It's so thrilling to be labeled a radical for carrying a message of basic rights and shared survival. And at the same time, I think of this image that we may have seen of this sort of watershed moment on the floor of the Montana State House, where you're raising the mic above your hand on your heart, sort of Statue of Liberty incarnate, if you will.
It's very kind.
In my heart. And to me, this is a radical moment. This is a moment of, we see your connection with the people reflected in a different way than the policy making. And I wonder what you've noticed so far about finding that balance to serve the people in these different ways.
So, people often have folks say, well, it must have taken a lot of courage to stand up on the floor. And I was like, actually, it was the easiest thing I've ever done, because there are often times when you're having policy conversations where there's not 100% right answer. You have to hit a green button or a red button at the end of the day, but you're like 60-40. Oh, this film tax credit, like, it's bringing industry into Montana, but also, it's going to cause a housing crunch. We haven't really solved that. Like, at the end of the day, I'm about 55 no, 45 yes, but then you have to hit the no button. There was a moment in that protest where it was so clear what the moral and just thing to do was, to stand alongside people fighting for democracy. So you do that work, and you recognize the ease of that moment, and you deal with the fallout later. You say, I will stand for what is right in this moment. And then it is a lot easier to have courage when it's like, what's the courage to respond to what happened, as opposed to the courage to, I don't know, wait for polling and see that the polling is 49-51 and then make a decision. You do what's right. You lead with that. And then in terms of the policy side of things, it's important to note, like, I didn't stop working on policy just because there were far right folks who did not like us. There's two sort of stories about this that I love. The first of which is there was a bill that was brought by a Democrat about banning robot murder police dogs, for lack of a better term. Neat.
Seems right.
Yeah. Well, the bill had some issues, because when he brought it, it said no individual can have these things, but government entities, including police, can, is what the bill said. So I went to the far right and I said, isn't it a shame that the government doesn't want you to have your personal robot murder police dogs? And they went, yeah, if I want to hunt with a murder robot, I should be able to hunt with a murder robot. And I said, and the government sure as hell shouldn't have access to them. And we killed that bill. So we have to get a chance to go do it again in a different year. But even from the far right and me personally, there was someone in the far right who was on the contingents, in the letters misgendering me regularly, who behind the scenes would say, stay strong, sister, every time. Would gender me correctly every time. And I had to call her out for her votes for why the hell are you signing this letter? You know better than that. But then also, when I brought housing policy, that was one of the only tenants' rights bills to make it through the House, which said, if a landlord is going to change the price of your rent, rather than 30 days notice, they need to give you 60 days notice, because it takes a hell of a lot of time to figure out how to land into a new home. And she stood up and said, I want to thank Representative Zephyr for bringing this. This is great policy. There was someone who was a very borderline white nationalist who stood up in support of this policy because of the relationships we built. Also, there was a woman in the Republican Party who every weekend would go speak to her QAnon constituents and craft whatever wild things. She was one of the only people to vote in support of a bill that said, if you have had any vaccinations, you cannot donate blood. That bill failed. She got up and talked about the way the blood had changed. The president of the Red Cross said, please don't do this. You'll kill so many people if you ban 90% of donations. She came every day in a beautiful dress and a beautiful little matching hat that was in honor of her late mother, who wore hats all the time. And every day for the first 3 weeks of the legislature, I complimented her on her beautiful outfit, her shoes, the hat, matching hat, the jewelry that she wore, and she would compliment me. And we just had a fun little time talking about how beautiful our outfits were. At the end of the third week, and one of the things, and so just to note, she's not just a random legislator. She pre-filed bills, 6 of which were targeting the trans community, including a bill that was chromosome testing at birth. Mm-hmm. This is someone who I did not come into the building and say, battle lines are drawn, we're not talking. I was nice to her every day. At the end of the third week, she met with me on our way out and stopped with one of the trans lobbyists and said, can we talk about trans stuff? I said, yeah. And we talked for an hour. And at the end of the hour, she said, Zooey, I don't understand this stuff, but I don't want to hurt you. I don't think I'm going to run my bills. And I said, okay. And then the weekend passed and Monday showed up and she said, Zooey, I prayed on it and I need to do right by you. I'm not going to vote on these. She voted for every anti-trans bill, but she did not run her 6. That's moving the needle. That is what representation gets you. That is having the courage to talk to someone who, by and large, does not recognize your full humanity in their votes.
Wow. Thank you. I'm thinking this week of the State House protests from the spring, as we see images, videos coming through of yesterday, thousands of Jewish Americans gathered in the nation's capital, organizing with Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, to peacefully protest in solidarity with the people of Palestine. Hundreds gathered in the US Capitol, singing together, facing arrest, chanting, ceasefire now, no genocide in our names. I'm reminded of the potential of a democracy of shared refusal to dehumanize a perceived other, refusal to remain desensitized to, as Eqbal said, the pathology of power. I'm wondering if you would tell us more about what you've noticed about, as we enter the halls of government peacefully, accused of insurrection, how do we keep our imagination, endurance to speak truth to power?
Wow, that is maybe the best question I've ever gotten.
Thanks.
I was driving, I was in a car with someone on the way over here from my last event in Cambridge, and I was working on drafting a statement around Israel-Palestine. And so it's been on the top of my mind lately. And I kept thinking at the beginning, you stood up there and you gave this really moving land acknowledgement. And what was sitting in my heart was, God, I hope we never see a day where Israel is giving a land acknowledgement about, what happened generations back to Palestine and the cruelty there, and saying like, it's easy to look at a moment in history removed from it and say the way the American government treated the Native Americans of this land was wrong. How do you sit with something in the moment where in a moment there's violence, in a moment there are atrocities, multifold atrocities. How do you sit with that in a moment and say, yeah, but by and large, we have to recognize an apartheid state when we see it. We have to recognize occupied land when we see it. And how do you have the courage to stand up? And, speaking at Harvard yesterday, there is a truck outside of Harvard with students' faces who went to a pro-Palestine protest, doxing them. There are several people who have had their law firm offers rescinded. How do you, in this moment, have, what does it mean to have strength in this moment? And the answer is much like that answer around courage, is if you stop and think like, what does it mean to be courageous in this moment? What does it mean? What are the fallouts? Like, what happens if in some way you've already lost a little bit, because it becomes harder and harder to speak up. And so to me, you take the action first and you deal with the fallout second. And there's sort of a coda to that. I did a business undergrad degree, and I had an accounting professor, and he would say again and again and again, at some point in your life, someone is going to ask you to do the wrong thing for the right reason. They are going to give you a really convincing, this is actually, you know, a good reason why we should stand down on this. It's a good reason why you should move this bucket of money into this thing. You know, it's not necessarily right to do that, but it's in the long run, it's for good. And I often think about that, you know, how do you justify saying, okay, I'm going to stand up and, you know, maybe if I stay quiet on this, like that's not necessarily the right thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do, but maybe there's a good reason to do it. And what he kept saying is, if you do that, it becomes easier and easier to just do the wrong thing. So I think it's incumbent on us to speak up, and it's incumbent on us to do that without the fear or without the worry about the fallout.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I'm going to move to some questions from our mentee. If you have questions that are bubbling up as you hear Representative Zephyr's comments, feel free to add more questions. And I'm going to switch to my laptop here. So, you know, let me take just a moment. We've got a couple SMASH-related questions, but I'm going to...
Oh, those are quick. Give me a quick rapid fire SMASH question. It's like an icebreaker.
Well, we'll start with, you know, do you see connections between your experience with SMASH and with your current work in the world of politics?
Yeah, actually, this is a really ha.
We're talking about Super Smash.
But Super Smash Brothers
for those not in the know.
But actually, so another parallel to this is I was a high level athlete in high school. I was a nationally ranked wrestler prior to my transition. And one of the things that high-level athletes and high-level competitors, whether it's an e-sport or a regular sport, you have to have a short memory. You have to have a very short memory for your losses, and you have to have an even shorter memory for your victories. It would be easy to say, we held the powerful accountable, good job, I'm gonna rest on that laurel. No, there's work to be done. There's policy to be crafted. There's federal policy to push on. You know, that's the work. Or to say, oh, we got kicked out or these bad bills passed. What are we going to do? Well, we turn to community care immediately. And so I think any level of competition or honestly performance, I think music performance can also teach similar lessons, is how do you move through victory and through defeat quickly with an eye on what comes next, and importantly, a belief that regardless of what comes next, you go into every confrontation believing you're going to come out successful. That's what matters in high-level competition, and I think it's important in our daily lives as well. Didn't expect that answer, did you? Ha ha ha!
Wow. So I'm going to summarize some of the sort of most frequently asked questions here. And, you know, I think this may be a question that you face frequently about things that you want the young people to know as we face these times. And I'm thinking a lot lately about, you said in your lecture, it's because we survived. And I'm thinking about the backlash that we're seeing and how it's this focus on, you know, we want to protect the children, unless those children are LGBTQ, unless those children are trans. And I think a lot about, as you know, increasingly grown trans millennial in these times where I look to my ancestors, my transcestors, to those still with us and those on the other side, and I look to the youth who lead me every day. And it's an interesting moment to know that without, I think, this legacy of those of us who have said, yeah, we're here, would there be this moment of backlash, you know, towards our youth who we're working to hold and support? So I wonder, in that context, what do you want the young people to know today?
I think, you know, you recognize for better and worse, the cyclical nature of the fight. You know, when they fly around the same half dozen detransitioners to come give a talk about how, you know, they found the right path. It is a direct echo of the ex-gays being flown around and being saying, well, I found the Lord and now I suddenly see the error of my wicked homosexual ways. You know, those are, you know, language like groomer is a direct echo of the recruitment language that we've seen. So it's important to recognize that we've been here in the past and we've beat these bills back in the past. There's a reason they're coming after trans people by and large, and why they started with something like sports, a subset of a subset, is because they're trying to peel off people, members of the community, to go through the broad attacks more broadly. In the same way we saw limited restrictions on abortion in various states until they could build up a large enough attack on Roe. And so we see the cyclical nature of this. And then we also recognize who got us through this. By and large, it's us. It's us doing the work and, you know, in our communities. I talk about every room matters. Public opinion on LGBTQ people shifts over time. The more and more someone knows somebody. Recent polling showed 30% of Americans know trans people, and they are like double as likely to support LGBTQ policies and trans inclusionary policies if they know someone. So that makes a difference. And then you talk about our past. I remember Margaret in her opening talking about the cowboy and Indian films and saying, oh, this is the group that I align with, and talk about the, you know, presentation of an erased history. You know, I think it's important for us in our communities to acknowledge, yes, we have a history. And obviously we can talk about Stonewall. But it's important when we talk about Stonewall, like you've seen the pictures with the bricks thrown and all of that. If you also, there are photos of the next day of them all in front of the building, smiling, happy. There's joy there. When we think about the fights, you know, through the AIDS epidemic, it was largely an act up. It was, you know, radicals pushing back against the government that seemed not to care about us. And there was a lot of folks in the lesbian community who were there hand in hand with the gay community, supporting one another. You go farther back in time, you look at the early 1900s, we have folks like Lucy Anderson, who was a Black trans woman out in California, who at the age of 6, her parents brought her to the doctor and said, she's wearing, you know, girl's clothes and she says she's a girl, and what do we do, doc? And the doctor said, she ain't hurting nobody, like let her be, let her live her life. And she did. And she was supported and cared for by her community. She became this well-known chef. And it was found out later in her life that she was trans, and they arrested her. And the response was a bunch of the elite from the city came and protested at the jail and said, that's the best party thrower in town. That's the best chef in town. Give us our chef back. And she was released and went back to that community. So we have that. If you go back even farther, the earliest writings, like Elagabalus and the priestesses of Inanna, were supporting trans women.
Let's go all the way back.
Let's go all the
Zephyr.
way back.
Yes.
Like, yes. And so what I want the youth to know is like that history exists, and it exists in layers of, you know, erasure, both from, you know, the focus in the moment, the cruelty of the moment, efforts to, you know, forcibly remove histories like, you know, our books and our art forms, but also just a lack of knowledge about, you know, what is buried in our history, not just the struggle, but the successes and the joys. So that's what I'd want you to know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're reaching the end of our time for today, but I want to ask you one more question. We've got a lot of questions coming through from Zoom and from folks in the room about, you know, these themes that you've brought us through in your story of working on the outside, the work of activism, of pushing upstream, the work of working on the inside, those who might be interested in serving legislatively and investigating the possibilities of democracy in all of its shapes, forms, and challenges. Some folks want to know what advice you would give to those who might be interested in trying to find their path in that way, and questions about how easy it is to feel a sense of hopelessness, a sense of, someone says, doomerism.
Yeah. So I'm going to sit on three things in there. The first of which is, it is probably the most radical thing that I will say, but like, if you feel trapped by institutions, like you need people fighting from the outside and the inside. You know, if you're trying to break out of some sort of prison, like build a tunnel from both sides, you're going to get there twice as fast. You need people in the system, in the halls of power fighting. But there's a reason that I'm going and talking to community activists, and I'm not saying, hey, hold up, you're making this really hard for the Democratic Party. I'm like, hell yeah, go do it, you know? And even at college, I remember there was a big protest, and I was working in the provost's office, and the president came up and said, oh, these guys are making it really hard. Don't they recognize that, like, we have our hands tied by Title IX, and like we can't really investigate this unless more things come out? We can't do anything right now. Yes. And what I said is, like, those students, that you want that. You want them pushing the envelope, because that's what makes it possible down the road for us to change systems and to move things. If they're not up fighting tooth and nail. And then in terms of, like, if you want, there's fighting doomerism, and if you want to get involved in office, when it comes to fighting the sense of hopelessness, I will channel my lovely therapist, who talks about the horizons. You know, how do you bring in a horizon to the point where things are workable again? You know, I have to work on energy policy in the state of Montana. Which is, by the way, a state that held v. Montana, the first climate case in the world where youth sued. Yeah,
That's
hell
right.
yes.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Youth sued over the legislature's failure to address climate change. They won, and one of the reasons they won is because our state Supreme Court is, to use my fiance's term, goated. And has in it a provision that says every government agency must work to maintain and enhance a clean and healthful environment. So that exists, but we're fighting energy. We're like working on energy policy. If I'm looking on like 100-year, 200-year timeline, that is just like, I will freeze, because it's horrifying to think like, oh, there's a disaster already beginning to happen. We have smoke season in Montana. There's a disaster happening. I can't think on that 200-year time scale. Bring the horizon in. What can I do now? What can I do in this legislative session? How can I move the needle here? How can I set up for 25? Or if that's too much, like, bring it in. What can I do this week? What is going on this week that I can help at? And you do that on every sort of topic, and your horizon will be different day to day, depending on your mood and where you are. It'll be different on your expertise on a topic and your fire for a topic. Maybe in your circle, you can focus 4 years out. But when it comes to another community circle, you're like, okay, you're gonna take the lead, and I can only look about, a month out, and that's what I've got energy for. You figure out what the horizons are, and do not let yourself go beyond them. If you get beyond them, apologize, like, forgive yourself, reset, bring it in, and go. And then lastly, if you want to get involved in political office, put down roots in as many places in your community as possible. I cannot tell you the amount, like, I, again, knocked 6,000, 8,000 doors, and the number of people who I was 1 degree removed from was enormous. Because I'd gone to the farmers markets and the art galleries and worked on campus and been to the bars with the grad students. And suddenly you find yourself, I'm not kidding when I say doors get opened, not because of some brilliance or this, but because you are connected to every spot in your community. Do that work. And then if you find yourself part of a community who you feel like needs additional representation that is not represented in your bodies of government, find the people doing the work. I called every trans legislator who was serving in America and said, what do I need to know? Who do I talk to? I sat down with every Democrat. I sat down with several Republicans and said, what do I need to do? What do I need to know? Had my, as they call it, the 100 cups of coffee. Do that, absorb every piece of information you can, root yourself in your community, and then go and do not look down. Because campaigning is one of the most, like, mind-melting experiences, because you are sprinting. I was working 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. and knocking doors from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then doing back-end work until midnight, going to bed. On the weekends, knocking doors from 11 to 7 p.m. and you're just doing that with just kind of how's the campaign going? You know, we don't have big polling, it's just kind of vibes. So you just go and have that faith, take the 100 cups of coffee and trust yourself and run. So.
Thank you so much, Representative Zephyr. Thank you to all of you here today. Thank you to those online. A few housekeeping items as we close, and then we'll give Zooey another rousing Hampshire thank you. Thank you to Margaret Cerullo, to all those who have supported this lecture series over the years, to Dana Ahern, to President Wingenbach, and all those who've organized this day for us to learn together. We have a reception outside in the FPH courtyard. We're eager to chat, mingle, and say hello. Tomorrow we have a teach-in here in FPH on Israel and Palestine. It is happening at 1 p.m. Oh, good, 1 p.m. And we welcome you to come on back here and learn more. And let's share our gratitude again with Representative Zephyr. Thank you so much.
If you had a question,